As I said at the top of the show, we're going to talk about the new look of the General Assembly and what it might mean for education. And joining us first is Rob Christensen. Rob is the former chief political writer, reporter, columnist for the venerable News and Observer here in Raleigh. You recently retired from the News and Observer after covering politics in North Carolina for 45 years. And I read every governor since Terry Sanford and every senator since Sam Ervin. So, Rob, welcome to Education Matters.
Glad to be here.
Thanks so much. All right, well, my first question is, I had Peter Hans, the president of the community college system, on last week. And now, understandably, he had a very cautious answer, and you may have one as well. But I was curious because I've been in my role at the Public School Forum for 5 years, and there was a panel that I attended back when I first started, and you had all the education leaders of North Carolina together. And it was Tom Ross, the UNC president, you had Scott Rawls, the head of community colleges, you had June Atkinson, and you had Hope Williams from the independent colleges. Well, 3 of those 4 are gone now, and actually 2 of those positions have been now replaced twice. The UNC system with Margaret Spellman's departure, and now with Peter coming in. So I guess from your perspective, you've been watching the politics and the changes like this. I mean, what is going on with these kinds of changes? Is this good? Is it bad? Is it too early to tell? Is it expected? What do you think?
Well, I think it reflects the political turbulence of the era. We have not only two-party government, but we have a very polarized situation. And so when you have turnover of, in the University of North Carolina presidency, for example, that was the first one when Tom Ross went. It was Republicans coming in with the new Board of Governors and replacing the Republican establishment, replacing the Democratic establishment, essentially. But you also have factions within the Republican Party. And so, you know, not everybody wanted the outgoing president, Margaret Spellings. And I think she felt like she didn't have the full support of everybody, of all factions within the party. And the Republican Party is not monolithic anymore than the Democratic Party is. So part of that is a reflection of the times. We had the turnover in superintendent of public instruction. The Republicans have been doing better in these council state races, statewide races. They've been getting higher and higher percentages as the state has divided. The thing to think about all this is that North Carolina is, and this is demonstrably true, that it is one of the most closely divided states in the country, and its politics are some of the roughest and some of the most divided. And so that's reflecting now on who...
Now or historically?
Now, particularly, yeah. Now in a couple decades, and it's getting worse. And so because it's such a closely divided state, and there's very few states in the country that are as closely divided as North Carolina, you might say Ohio or Florida or something like that, you're going to have this kind of switching and changes in education leadership. Question your answer ask is it good for North Carolina? Probably not. It's good to have new ideas come in. It's good to have Republican participation in this, but this kind of partisan wrangling is not necessarily good.
Right. So the General Assembly will be convening this week. I mean, just briefly, and then before they really get down to work. They're coming in now, Republicans, for the first time without their supermajority, basically not an automatic veto override if they wanted to. I think the last time that happened, somewhat similar, was when Governor Bev Perdue's final 2 years in office, which, although I think the dynamics are a little different now than they were then. And then before that, Jim Martin, actually for 8 years, we chatted about that before we started. So I guess tell me a little bit about what that historically looks like, and do you think some of those historical patterns will be there this time?
So first of all, it makes me somewhat pessimistic about major education reforms this session. So if I could just step back a little bit, I mean, the story of North Carolina politics over the last 100 or so years has been catch-up. I mean, the state was very poor, very agriculture and industrialized and so forth, but has never, ever caught up with the rest of the country in education spending. There have been times when we've done better than other times, but it's catch-up. And so when we've had major crusades to improve education, it has required bipartisan support, or if the Democrats were just in control, really strong Democratic support. But more than that, it is for people who you can point to as particularly good leaders in education, like former Governor Jim Hunt. They were able to get a broad coalition that included the business leadership of the community, some of the religious leadership of the state, and just all across the board. And he was able to reach out. So he got Smart Start started when the House was under Republican control, and he did this by personal touch, by lobbying. He went to Harold Brubaker was the speaker back in the 1990s, the first Republican speaker, and he went and visited him on his cattle farm in I guess it was Randolph County. And so it's possible to do this, but to make this kind of cross-party coalition. But that was the 90s, and is now a much polarized environment. Plus, working across party lines is even more difficult because there's a lot more skepticism in Republican ranks now about public education. Now, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. There are a lot of very good supporters of public education among Republicans, but there's also a certain amount of skepticism, and we've seen that from everything from calling them government schools to support for homeschooling or for charter schools and everything. And so it's hard to build up that kind of broad bipartisan support for a coalition to make a really substantial jump ahead in education, given the current political environment, divided government, and Republicans somewhat skeptical of public education.
Yeah, and the notion of it being a public good, right? I mean, do you think, because I guess growing up here in North Carolina, to me, education, we may have been playing catch up, but it seemed like we were all on the same team playing catch up. Do you think that that commitment to the public education for a public good is broken now?
Well, so I just finished a book on the Scott family, called The Branchhead Boys, which is coming out in May.
Coming out in May.
Yeah,
the
yes, yes, indeed.
Okay.
And Bob Scott, he was governor. He was elected 1968, 68, 72, and he was there when schools were truly integrated. They were just marginally integrated before then, but they really integrated during his time. And he commented and worried, both publicly and in a diary he kept, about whether this was breaking broad public support for public education, because that was during that period you had a tremendous number of private schools that were created. Right. So it's not all about school integration, although that's part of the thing, but it's about whether the right values are being taught in schools and political correctness and all that sort of thing. But I think it's unquestionably true that the support for public education is not quite what it was a generation ago.
Just as we wrap up, you had a great column, I think back in December, about top 10 things you learned covering politics. And what you mentioned, you just touched on a couple of them. You mentioned about cutting taxes don't work because you said it undercuts the ability to fund schools. You also mentioned the university system. You also mentioned rural North Carolina, which is something that we're beginning to talk about more at our organization. What do you see about what's needed in rural North Carolina?
So rural North Carolina was always behind the metropolitan areas, but the divide seems to be growing, and so the rural North Carolina is contracting in terms of population, while the metropolitan areas are growing, and they're falling further and further behind. The gap's growing. So it's urban rural, but it's also white collar, blue collar. So so I think we need to think about. Not in education, we tend to focus most of our attention on the university system because that's been a driver in Research Triangle Park or in the public schools. But we also have to think about things like community colleges, which really reach a tremendous number of people, and non-traditional students. And we also have to think about other ways that we haven't put as much emphasis on as we might have, or some other states have, like programs that train people right in high school so they have it in a particular skill, that those who are not interested in going off to college, who can learn a skill and come right out of high school and get a good job. There's more paths to success than just college, and I'm a big supporter of college. Right. But we have to realize that college is not for everybody. And there's things like internships and apprenticeships, right, and that sort of thing.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. Lots of great conversation, though. You said you weren't an education expert, so I think you've got a lot of good thoughts on it. So, Rob, look, thanks for all your insights and for your coverage these last decades. I'm glad that you're still out and writing. So we'll plug your book on our website.
Okay.
So, thanks, Rob.
Great.
When we come back, we'll be joined by Liz Schlemmer from WUNC and Billy Ball from NC Policy Watch. But before we go to break, see if you can answer this question. Wake County Schools is the largest school district in North Carolina with more than 162,000 students. What is the state's smallest district with just 600 students?
Education Matters is brought to you each week in part by Paragon Bank, serving others, enriching lives.